Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Peter Jennings, and I go by CSURAM88 across the daily fantasy industry. And I'm pumped to be back again here at FantasyLabs doing a review of the FanDuel 5 million World Fantasy Football Championship. Another great live final. Really great time at a beautiful venue outside of LA. You basically had views of the ocean across the entire property where the live final was had, and just a ton of fun to meet new people and obviously see a lot of old friends and compete for $1 million in fantasy football. So had a great time. Finished 18th out of 100 for 60,000. My equity in the event was 50,000 with one seat. So cashed for a little bit more than my equity, which I can't complain about, and felt pretty good about the process that I had making my team. And I hope it's helpful for you guys. I'm going to kind of go into some game theory stuff and talk about the challenges of making a tournament team this week, especially for a tournament like this. So we'll take a look at my team here, and I'll get into kind of the challenges that I was talking about specifically to this week. So if we look at my team, I went with a Carson Palmer stack to Jermaine Gresham. I went Le'Veon Bell and Devontae Freeman as my running backs. And then at receiver, I went Sanders, Beckham, and Diggs. All owned, but no one super owned. And then I went with Nick Novak and the Chiefs defense. So I feel pretty good about my team. And I'll start with the first challenge that I had making a team. And in cash games this week, I played Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson on 100% of my teams. And that made sense for a lot of reasons. Those guys have the highest expected points. It was supposed to be a really low scoring week. And, basically all of 2016 has just been try to jam in Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson whenever you can. And it made sense again this week. Both of those guys were over 60% owned in this tournament. And from a roster construction standpoint, that was really the only logical place to spend when trying to make an optimal lineup was on Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson. The receivers that you'd pay up for, Odell Beckham had a much lower expectation than either of the running backs. Not the best matchup for him against Detroit, not awful. And then Antonio Brown, who you really would want to play, was in a really tough spot because Pittsburgh was at Cincinnati for their second game against them in the division, where there's a huge FantasyLabs trend. Teams perform much worse against a team in the second time within the division that year. Big Ben was on the road, so he has huge home road splits, which affects Antonio Brown. And Cincinnati historically has actually done well against Antonio Brown on a relative scale. Obviously, Antonio Brown is the best receiver in football and still could have a big game, but they have contained him better than almost any team. So it was challenging figuring out where to spend. So I had decided to go away from David Johnson and use Carson Palmer and Gresham instead. Obviously, there's more leverage taking a quarterback when the other running backs can be higher owned. When the running back's not a huge pass catcher, Palmer still could have easily thrown a touchdown to David Johnson. In fact, he's been crushing on the receiving touchdowns all year. So it wasn't a complete leverage play, but I did feel okay about fading him to get Devontae Freeman in. And this is the thing I felt really good about all week, was that the Falcons were in a historic spot relative to their team total on a week where we had historically low team totals. So across the board, I believe if you added up all the team totals, it was the lowest collective team total grouping for the guys playing on this slate that had been in a couple years. And then you had the Falcons, who had the highest team total since 2014. So very interesting that within this low team totals, because of all the weather and the matchups, you had the Falcons as a huge outlier. And the concern with taking Falcons was a blowout where they would get sit in the fourth quarter, which did end up happening with the Falcons guys, but certain guys still got there, like Devontae Freeman. And I guess that was the other challenge, was pinpointing who you wanted to take on the Falcons, because there are so many ways they could score. I mean, you had Freeman and Coleman at the running back who could both go off, and then obviously a ton of options for Matt Ryan with Julio Jones out. So I felt good that I got Devontae Freeman at 8%, a little bit of a risk, but I like spending up there relative to going both Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson here in the live final, which I did think was by far and away the optimal play in cash games. I just tried to leverage myself, given that it was a tournament that was relatively top heavy in terms of the payout structure. At receiver, I went Stephon Diggs, who was the big disappointment. He was 17% owned. I really liked him in this spot versus the Colts at home. Minnesota had the highest relative team total, basically implying that their team total was much higher than it normally is. It was over 25 points against the Colts, who had a ton of injuries, and they were at home, and the whole Minnesota offense just completely flopped. So Missed out on that with Diggs, but don't hate the process there. Liked going balanced at receiver. Then I had Odell Beckham and Emmanuel Sanders. Sanders and Diggs were going to be locked no matter what. The big pivot that I went away from was going away from basically David Johnson and Crabtree, who ended up being very high owned. David Johnson over 60%, Crabtree being 50% for Odell Beckham and Devontae Freeman. And I feel pretty good about that process overall, and definitely knowing what I know now with the ownerships, I definitely would do it again. But at the time of making that decision, I did not feel great about it. So Emmanuel Sanders, I love both Broncos receivers. They both, DT had a better game than Emmanuel. Didn't work out, but I like the thought process there. Basically, you are hoping for good game flow for the Broncos, and you know where the volume's going to go. Sanders and Demaryius Thomas have the highest market share of any duo of receivers in the NFL. So felt good about that, and Emmanuel Sanders definitely paid off big time last week in the DraftKings Fantasy Football Championship. Then I had Nick Novak as the kicker. That really worked out. Part of the reason I had a good finish, I got a good performance out of my kicker and the Chiefs defense, who I loved. The interesting thing was Kai Forbath for the Vikings was really heavily owned at min-price, and so was the Vikings defense. So a lot of guys on similar plays, which was interesting, and that was the challenging part about it, is kind of figuring out how to go away from these optimal cash lineups. And it was tough because there wasn't really good ways to spend the money. So you either had to pay up for Odell and kind of do something a little different, to get away from David Johnson, or just go with a more standard roster construction. So I thought it was a challenging week. Let's take a look here at the winner. Corey27, big time congrats. Went with Carson Palmer. David Johnson, you can see here, 67%. LaShawn McCoy, who is the other leverage play away from those two, who was in a great spot against Cleveland, went off for a huge game. If anyone would have gone LaShawn and Freeman, they could have been really in a nice position. Then Larry Fitzgerald, Michael Thomas, and Brandon Cook. So I actually really like this, going with the full game stack here and just hoping it shoots out. And that's what happened. Got 90 points out of this game, which was obviously a great result and a really nice team. Brandon Cooks at 5% owned was really the key here. And then Ryan Griffin at tight end, who was the other option versus Gresham. I thought that was a good play, and had the bad results of kicker and defense, which was very common with Forbath and the Vikings D, 42% and 31%, but the rest of the lineup was still so good to overcome that. So congrats to Corey27 and everyone else who did well. E. Scott, who finished first last week with another performance, in ninth. G. Risen, who I got to spend a lot of time with out in LA, just an awesome dude and a great guy. A lot of fun hanging out. Congrats to him as well. All these players at the top definitely deserve big congrats for good scores here in this live final. So with that, again, I'm Peter Jennings. I go by CSURAM88 across the daily fantasy industry, and wish all the Fantasy Lab subscribers good luck this upcoming weekend. We do have the $1,500 tournament on DraftKings with $1 million up top. So one big tournament to fire at for the end of the year. And as always, just looking to see you guys at the top of the leaderboard.